Hey, everybody. We're going to continue our series on the scripture and matters pertaining to LGBTQ folk. And our first session has to do with the story in the scripture of Sodom and Gomorrah. So we're going to get right started, get started real quick. After a little bit of context, we'll hop into the scripture, read the scripture, and then we'll discuss it. So the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah has historically been used to condemn homosexual practice and to teach about how God feels about gay folk. But is that what the scripture really teaches? So let's find out together. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, or maybe more accurately, the story of Lot and his family in Sodom, takes up a chapter in the book of Genesis in the midst of the saga of the patriarch Abraham. At this point in scripture, we'd already been introduced to Sodom and its twin city, Gomorrah, because they have been involved in some wars that Abraham had been in as well. But then Abraham's nephew Lot goes his separate ways from his uncle, and the scripture says that Lot pitched his tent towards Sodom, went to live in Sodom while Abraham went the other way. In this story, just before the one we're about to read, messengers from God, some translations say angels, visit Abraham to let him know that they are headed to Sodom and Gomorrah, and if the inhabitants there are as awful as they've been hearing, then they are going to bring justice to the city by destroying it. And Abraham pleads that if there were good people in the city, are they going to destroy the good people along with the bad people? So Abraham says, what if there's 100? And God says, no, I won't destroy it if there's 100 good people. And Abraham argues with God, gets God all the way down to 10, which is, by the way, such an incredibly cool and Hebrew thing to do, right? To argue with God, to like sort of bargain with God, and God's like, sure, why not? I think that's a perfect example, rather than seeing scripture as this one thing that can never be interacted with. You just have to accept it, or rather than accepting that God just has one thing, and if it's God's will, then it's nothing, right? Abraham and even Moses, the folks in the Hebrew Bible argue with God. They talk back to God. They do things. They have a relationship with God, which is a healthy thing, not an offensive thing. Question your faith, question God, ask questions, bargain, do whatever you want. Anyway, Abraham gets God, bargains God all the way down to 10. Perhaps God knew already what was going to happen. And so God says, I will not destroy the city if there are 10 not awful people in the city. And then the messengers set off towards the city. So that's the prologue. The cities in Sodom and Gomorrah are described as being located right in the middle of where the Dead Sea is right now. So spoiler alert, once the city is destroyed, the people all turn to salt, and a large crater is formed there. Presumably, this is where the Dead Sea comes from. Dead because nothing can live there because of the high salt content, but maybe also because the salt that is there is, legend has it, the remains of Sodom and Gomorrah's dead. So it might be a wondrous story to think about in a mythological sense, but there is little, if any, archaeology to suggest that Sodom and Gomorrah were real cities, let alone ones that God actually completely destroyed by turning all of it into salt. But as with most things in Genesis, the story's point is the point, not the question of whether or not it was factual. So here's the story from Genesis 19, verses 1 through 10. The two messengers came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, please, my lords, come into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way. They said, no, we'll spend the night here in the square. But he urged them strongly, so they turned and came with him and entered his house. And he made them a feast, and he baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the people of the city, the people of Sodom, both young and old, all the folk from every quarter, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, where are the people who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may have sex with them. Lot went out of the door to them, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brethren, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not had sex yet. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these people, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as a foreigner, and he would play the judge," talking about Lot. "Now we will deal worse with you than with them." And they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near to the door to break it down. But the people inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. The story goes on that the messengers make all the people blind and then tell Lot and his family to get out of the city. And Lot's wife turns around and watches the city after she was told not to turn back around, and she turns to a pillar of salt, and Lot and his daughters escape into the mountains. There's a lot in that story that actually begs to be talked about. Probably the most important thing that begs to be talked about is the fact that we have traditionally heard that Lot is a decent or God-fearing person, but the point is that he took his daughters, who was his virgin daughters, and was going to throw them out to the mob. And what's going on here is, yes, Lot is an awful person for doing that, but it illustrates the point that in the culture of that time, and even again a lot of the culture today in the Middle East, hospitality was considered to be one of the highest virtues, right? Even over protecting your own family, you would protect the people who were staying with you, who you were protecting and who you were being hospitable to. Now, we can have a conversation about that, but that is not what is pertinent to this, because usually when people use this story, they're not talking about how awful Lot is and how you should protect your daughters. What they're normally talking about is why being gay is bad. So here in Genesis 19, we find that these messengers, or angels in some translations from God, have visited the twin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to gain firsthand witness of the city's injustice. The people in the surrounding areas have been crying out to God about them. So the patriarch Abraham has his nephew Lot, and he meets them and insists they spend the night with them, showing proper hospitality. And there's also a sort of impression of urgency in Lot's voice that raises suspicion, and then we'll soon find out why. Because after arriving at Lot's house, we read that the citizens of the city, both young and old, all of the folk from every quarter, had gathered around the house. Obviously the cities back then were much smaller, so it's not impossible for every single person in the city to have gathered around the house. They yelled for Lot to send out his guests so they could force sex on them. And, we just talked about how the story ends with the city actually being destroyed. And this is a story used to condemn gay folk, but even from that straightforward story, it's not at all clear that being gay is what this story is condemning. In fact, the story doesn't seem to be about being gay at all, but rather seems to be about rape and hospitality. It's about the kind of society that would not only allow this to take place, but promote it and allow it down to the last person in the city. So the word here that I've translated people is anse, or the root word is enosh, which means human or humankind. When used singularly, it could just be man. But when used in plural, it most often just refers to groups of people. Then later, the word translated folk is the Hebrew ha'am, with the root word being just am. It means folk or people, or sometimes even refers to groups of women. So there's nothing in the word usage of people, the word people or the word folk, although it is sometimes translated as men in some Bibles, but there's nothing that gives the impression that we're only talking about men here. This idea that this was homosexual activity is certainly not what is being presented at all. But even if the Bible made it clear that this was about gay activity, which it doesn't, as these messengers or people were angels or messengers from God, and the whole town, not just the men, were outside. But even if it was clear from this story that this was gay activity, it would be homosexual rape. It would be, the point is not gay, the point is rape, right? So rape, whether it's gay or otherwise, it's universally condemned among LGBTQ plus people. just as it is universally or nearly universally condemned among society at large and in the scriptures. And to this point, the Hebrew words that were used for people and folk, Anse and Ha'am, are not exclusively men. Therefore, it's not possible from this story to assert homosexual behavior, much less gay identity, is being condemned. Both men and women were involved. No distinction between the sin of either. And to further illustrate how God views this incident, however, we should view the lesson learned from this event and look no further than the Bible itself to comment on itself. The book of the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 16, verse 49 and 50 says this: "This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but they did not aid the poor and the needy." So number one, talking about the women in large, Sodom and her daughters. So bringing the women in as well. So it's not just the men. And then talking not about their sexual orientation or their even their proclivities to rape, but talking about how they had excess pride and they had food that was plentiful and everybody was living lives of ease, but they did not aid the poor and the needy. When people came to them, they did not help despite having plenty. So the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was not that they were gay, but that they looked too much like our modern world. In fact, it is clear from rabbinic interpretation as well that although Sodom may have used sex as the weapon, the violence and the lack of hospitality came from their hearts, not from their sexual preference. But what if we go further? 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 7 says that Lot was greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked. And the passage references the story of Sodom, but only in a vague sense, and there's nothing particularly about gay practice. Jude 7, however, goes further and says that Sodom and Gomorrah gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion. Some translations translate this as unnatural desire, but literally the word is sarkos heteros, which means different flesh, which is literally the opposite from homosexuality, right? It's seeking after the same homo sarkos would be same flesh. So this is like literally seeking after different flesh, but it doesn't refer to hetero or homo practice. It refers instead to the attempted rape of the angels, right? Which is a different flesh, right? Different form. And since the previous verse in Jude here references the Nephilim of Genesis 6, where sex between angels and humans is discussed, it is clear that Jude knew what was up and didn't attempt to make it about being gay either. The Book of Wisdom, some of you may or may not have heard of this. It's included in Orthodox and Catholics Bibles, but it's not in most Jewish or Protestant Bibles. It says this about Sodom: "For they justly suffered because of their wicked acts, for they of Sodom practiced a more bitter hatred of strangers. Others had refused to receive strangers when they came to them, but these made slaves of the guests who were their benefactors." So why do we use the word sodomy for gay sex? The use of the word sodomia, which means sodomy, didn't exist before 538 of the Common Era. That's when Byzantine Roman Emperor Justinian I declared that Sodom's sin had been specifically same-sex activities and the desire for them. Justinian was not a biblical scholar. He was an emperor. He was interested in creating laws. But he linked the famines and the earthquakes and the pestilences in Roman cities as being penalties for the crimes such as homosexuality that he called out. He gave the death penalty by beheading for the punishment of being gay, and it was him that introduced the idea that that homosexuality or being gay was to be punished not only legally, but he also said that it was a spirit. It would inherit a spiritual punishment as well. On a side note, the mild English profanity sod, as in sawed off, is derived from the usage of sodomy. So out of the more than 20 references to Sodom and Gomorrah in the rest of Scripture, none, exactly zero, mention same-sex behavior as even part of the reason for Sodom's destruction. So far from Sodom and Gomorrah being a proof text about being gay, rather it shows that when people who are different, strangers or the other, come into our midst, the only option to please God is to treat them well, whether they're different from us, whether they believe differently than us, whether, for whatever reason, people who come into our country and into our cities and into our homes from other places, we are to treat them with the utmost respect and hospitality. And there's very little in the scripture that God takes more seriously than that hospitality. So it seems that our modern world has a lot to learn from this story, but being gay or not to be gay is not a lesson that this story is trying to teach. So I hope that helps. We'll see you next time when we discuss some of the passages from Leviticus.